Yoshi's Island, still one of the best looking, stylistically interesting, and biggest soundtrack bops on the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo, as I've said before, was my first console, getting it shortly before the GameCube. I used to play and borrow my cousin's copy of Yoshi's Island, and I loved it as a kid. You'd think they'd mind, but they actually didn't, because they hated the sound of Baby Mario crying. But unfortunately, as they lived a while away, and the Super Nintendo was pretty old at this point, it was difficult to find a copy of this game to have on my own. Fortunately though, being a kid of the early mid-2000s, I got the Game Boy Advance port of the game. Ah yes, no backlight. How I don't envy that. Years later, I did something really stupid, and I sold all my games for all my consoles that I didn't think was essential. And I will still mourn the loss of all those many games that I sold, as a 13-year-old stupid me. But you can see that Yoshi's Island was still, at that age, a must-stay. So wow, being able to play through the entire game on Switch again recently, from Nintendo Online, was amazing. It looked nice and crisp and finally on a good screen. I didn't even have to use this thing like I do with my PS2 and GameCube recordings. And what did I love most about it? Well, aside from the soundtrack and aesthetic, the bosses were surprisingly more awesome than I had remembered. Considering this game came off the heels of Super Mario World, which is a great game in and of itself, there is still no contest between the creativity, stylistic variance, and cool ideas when you compare the bosses. Now, all the bosses in Yoshi's Island are based on a size difference. Kamek just comes in normally and takes a common enemy from the world and makes it really big. Since you have previous encounters with the normal versions of the enemies, normally your intuition can guide you on how you might attack the big ones. Although sometimes it's not much of a help at all. They are most all really fun and entertaining, but I think when it comes to the bosses, there are 4, excluding the final boss, that really stuck out to me. And out of those 4, I want to try and explain why this guy is my favorite. When it comes to a lot of my favorite bosses, a lot of it has to do with how unique and interesting the boss reacts with the world, how the stage is influenced by the fight, and how fun the gameplay is, of course. Obviously, a lot of this is subjective, but that's what makes it a list of my favorites. First, I want to look at the frog boss. He's cool because, instead of him getting bigger, it flips the idea on its stomach and makes you smaller instead, which, on a first run as a kid, was crazy cool and scary to me. Speaking of stomachs, this boss is fought entirely inside of the frogs. Seeing the drips, and the idea that this frog was eating and digesting you and other enemies, as a concept, I found it really cool. The thing is though, I don't think it's very fun being cramped in the small area they gave, having to keep jumping around and sinking while aiming. It makes sense, and it's cool and creative, but it's just slightly annoying whenever you're trying to take aim and avoid the drips and then keep track of everything going on. Moving on quickly, next I really want to look at this hideous monster. I don't know why, but being a giant hairy jello-looking ghost thing should be more gross than this guy looks. The aesthetic of Sluggy, that's his name, still pulls through to make him look so endearing to me. And I like that a lot, not just about him, but about the entire aesthetic of Yoshi's Island. Also, the idea of having to hit the same spot multiple times and eventually expose and hit the heart is crazy creative and satisfying. Another thing that makes the fight more tense, at least as a kid, was knowing that if you didn't do it fast enough, he would slowly corner you and make you fall down into the pit, having to die and retry again. It was also so satisfying to sometimes make corrections to shots that may have been a little bit off, and seeing the way that his body adjusted and morphed to fit the shots. It was so cool. Unfortunately, that is the entire fight. It's just throw as many eggs as you can at the heart as quickly as you can until you win. So there isn't a lot of other fun gameplay variety to this fight. He doesn't even technically have an attack other than just hurting you if you touch him. That's why this one is a little less cool than my favorite for me. Another awesome one, and the one that probably has the coolest boss stage, is the giant raven thing that I always thought as a kid was a penguin. How it goes is you both leave the castle onto this tiny little planet that turns as you walk. You have to jump out of the way of these star attacks that go around the planet. And as you progress, the raven gets faster. And to damage the raven, you have to ground pound at a specific point when they're on the opposite side of the planet. Honestly, this would have been closer to being the coolest boss in my opinion, if it weren't for the ground pound part. In my opinion, I think it gets a little annoying trying to time the ground pounds correctly. Sometimes you don't know where they stop. This means, while it is really fun, the battle plays out a little longer without much variation, and can get a little irritating, at least compared to most other bosses. I remember playing this one as a kid in my parents' minivan, and trying to hide my anger, not because I died, but because I didn't hit the ground pound at the right moment, over and over and over again. So now that I've hopefully explained most of the pros that I think of with my other favorite bosses in the game, and discussed what draw back some of them in enjoyment for me personally, I want to really dig into what I love about my favorite boss. Hookbill the Koopa, from the get-go, has a really cool lead-up with the mist and fog, with the stage cutting you off from behind, but the stage isn't nearly as interesting as something like the Frog or the Raven. Still, I'm looking more at where the bar is normally set, which in my opinion is anything above a boss set inside of a general castle room, as many of the other bosses are. The Koopa looks so cute and Mario-ified in this game, so when you expect a bigger version of the Koopa, you expect this bigger version of this cartoony Mario character. But instead, they decide to horrifically morph it into this half-real looking turtle thing, which is way more awesome in my opinion, and definitely, as well as some of these others, spooked me as a kid. It sort of betrays the more cute aesthetic without completely getting rid of it, which still makes it look fine in the universe, but makes it more threatening as a boss. It gives it this sort of uneasy feeling, but of course, the thing that matters most, that I think it does well, is the gameplay. Hookbill is just a fun fight. In my opinion, it's the most fun fight in the game, and there is so much variety to how it plays out. From the start, you have to deal with two basic attacks, a charge and a dive attack. They are cool in variety specifically because one requires you to jump and avoid the hit, while the other requires you to sprint and not jump. It requires you to do the opposite. That means that there's a bit of tension and a close call to make when the build-up happens, because you don't know which attack he's going to take. It's cool, the two attacks play off of each other and require you to make different moves to avoid them, and by having them have a very similar lead-up, it then increases the tension of the boss fight. Moving on, when you're aiming at the head, you need 3 or 4 eggs to knock him over. This means you have to focus the aim, like with the frog, but you don't have to do all these extra jumps and fidgeting to try and get the shot right. I would also compare this to the sluggy fight a bit, because you use roughly the same amount of eggs to hit them, but you aim at different places instead of just the general heart, giving a little variety to what is essentially the same command. That isn't even how you get to do damage though. Instead, eventually after you've hit him enough times, it knocks him over on the back, and in order to actually finally get a hit on him, you have to ground pound strike him while he's on his back. And honestly, it's pretty satisfying, and leads into a third type of attack, the shell bounce to avoid. Still, to replenish eggs, the game has put in an even more creative way than many other bosses to get your eggs back. And how you do it is by jumping on him. It makes him cough them out, and then it signals all the eggs are out with an air cloud. The location of the eggs also means that you have to be quick, or you'll take another hit. In general, the amount of variety, steps, and variation in your core gameplay is greater in this battle than probably any other in the game. But never does it feel unfair, and that's because I really think it lets the gameplay speak. In other bosses, like the frog that I mentioned being one of my favorites, your aim is inhibited by this syncing feature that you don't really have a familiarity with. This boss fight relies solely on your ability to completely use Yoshi's base skills. It's just fun, and I genuinely love it. It feels like it's reaching the potential of what these controls were made for. It's honestly stuff like this that makes me so happy to make YouTube videos, because who's gonna sit and listen to me ramble about the turtle boss from Yoshi's Island in real life? For me, that's a pretty confident 0. But the truth is, it isn't really about me wanting to share who's my favorite boss, but wanting to share how much this game really means to me. How much I love it now, how much I loved it as a child, and how much it has held up as an amazing game 20 plus years after its release. Still bringing me memories of my family or road trips, of my childhood, and of course supplying what is still extremely an above par platforming experience. Thanks so much to the Single Way Out, Lachlan So Stupid, Akio, A Quiet Respect, Dolphinos, Whizbang2093, Frillneck Lizard, Thomas Greenway, CJ for the Whales, Sam Lloyd, all my other patrons, and of course, you. At least if you made it this far into the video. Hope everything is well, and I'll see you all soon.